and a great honor for us to be able to have here with us Professor Eugene Nida. I must confess that I am at a loss as to how to properly introduce him to you, how to convey to you, especially our students, who you know him by name, you've seen his books that we have in the library, but I don't know if you are aware to the extent of his prestige, magnitude, or his knowledge, and the vast influence that he has made on the study of translation. To limit myself to enumerating academic degrees or publications you see on the bulletin board, the list and list of his publications, or his translations, is not at all to do justice to him. Nor on the other hand do I wish to merely list qualifications or to give you a lengthy introduction. Of course, you have come to listen to Dr. Nida. I will therefore be very brief, but I think you will be especially interested in knowing some of the background information on Dr. Nida's studies. It was out of his interest in languages, initially classical languages, Greek and Latin, and the minor languages of French and German, coupled with his love for the church and the Bible, that he developed his linguistic studies of the Bible. Initially, his work was focused on descriptive linguistics, cultural anthropology, and intercultural communication. And it was from his experiences as a translator of the Bible that he formulated his theories of translation. And their theories, as probably you know, that have completely revolutionized the whole field of translation, the studies of translation. And the prestige of his work in the aspects of the function of language structure, semantic structure, translation of fluency across languages and culture is unmeasurable. You've seen the books in the library, I'm sure you're quite familiar with. Three main books: Toward the Science of Translating and the Theory and Practice of Translation, of which he was the co-author, and especially Language Structure and Translation. Professor Nida's work has taken to many countries. I read a book that was published perhaps 20 years ago that he had, at that time, speaking of, I think, 75, done work in 75 different countries, so no doubt it's been a good many more by now.
It's 85.
It is 85 now. Carrying out research, fieldwork in more than 200 languages. So this is to give you some idea. I will not list or continue to list his many accomplishments. We all know, especially our students in translation, how language and culture are interlinked, and you as students are concerned precisely with the intercultural, interlinguistic communication. And it is therefore a very great pleasure that we have Professor Nida today to speak to us on sociolinguistics and translating. Thank you.
I am delighted to have an opportunity of being here. And I want to congratulate you for studying here. You may not know it, but you are studying in one of the best and most creative programs in translation that exists any place in the world. Now let me assure you, I'm not exaggerating. And I have visited most of these programs, and I'm very pleased to see what your faculty is doing. It's tops. But in talking about sociolinguistics and translation, I want to first make a clear distinction between linguistics and sociolinguistics. Linguistics deals with the structures of language and the relationship between these structures. Sociolinguistics deals with the uses of language, how people employ their own language or others, and the values that are associated with those various uses. And so, I want to try to explain some of the implications of all of this. I first ran into problems years ago when I was working in Mexico, 5 days by horseback from the end of the railroad, working among the Tarahumara Indians. And I said to an Indian, because I wanted to learn the language, what is the word for the color of the grass? He said, Sionami. And later I pointed to the sky and I said, what's the word for the color of the sky? He said, Sionami. But I said, they are different colors. He said, yes, they are. But I said, you use the same word. He said, of course, because they're the same. Now that may sound strange to you, but in many languages, especially in Africa, they will only have 4 or 5 color words. But they could always explain colors by likening them to a bird or to a flower. All people have the capacity for actually identifying approximately 14 million different shades and colors. Our eyes are amazing. But no language has 14 million color words. All languages divide up experience and use words to cover areas of experience. But they divide up the experience in very different ways. In English, we have only one word for a cousin. In Spanish, primo, prima. But in Chinese, 8 different words for cousins, depending on sex, the age of your parents and uncles and aunts, as well as the degree of lineage involved. Now, words, however, only have meaning in the culture of the people who speak the language. One poor missionary made a bad mistake. He was translating the Gospel of Matthew, and he asked the people, what is your word for virgin? And they gave him a word, and he put it in the New Testament. But after the New Testament was published, there was a great deal of interest in a special cult, a secret society for young women. And in the initiation, they went through ritual sexual intercourse, which made them no longer virgins. But of course, the missionary preached against this cult and society. But they said, how can you preach against it? The mother of Jesus belonged to this cult. It was a word which did mean a virgin, but it meant a virgin that went into this particular cult or society involving that initiation. So, words only have meanings in terms of the culture of which the language itself is a part. Now in linguistics, there have been generally 4 different areas, 3 very important in the past. When William Jones, back in 1786, suggested that Sanskrit was related to Greek and Latin, it was like an academic bomb exploding. And soon, people realized that German was also related, and English, and even Tokharian, way out in Turkestan. But then people became excited not only in the history of languages, but in comparing languages. Comparative linguistics arose. Then people said, why don't we simply describe languages like they really work, apart from their history or comparison? And they developed descriptive linguistics, the Prague School, the Russian structuralist. A number of people like Boas, Sapir, Bloomfield, Harkett, and of course, numerous linguists of the present day. But there is a 4th type of linguistics, sociolinguistics, the use of language within a culture and the relationship of language to society. Well, it became perfectly obvious in Papua New Guinea. They had to do something about sociolinguistics. In the country of Papua New Guinea, there are 2.5 million people, but they speak at least 700 different languages, completely mutually unintelligible. How can you set up a program of education with 700 languages? It's bad enough to have 2 in Spain. So what they did was to concentrate on a language they called talk peace. This is just English for talk, and peace means business. And this was a trade language. And it started out as just a pidgin language, a second trade language for everyone. But soon, there were 100,000 people who spoke this as their only language. And it grew rapidly into what we call a Creole. And now, it is one of the principal languages of education. Although sometimes the words are fascinating. They didn't have a word for piano, but they had seen people play a piano, and they said a piano is, hit him, you hit him teeth, he squeal. Because the keys of the piano looked like ivory teeth. And of course the piano then reacted by making a noise. But most people assume that in Europe there are more people speaking a second or third language than in any other part of the world. But that isn't true. There are more multilingual people in Africa than in any other part of the world. Almost everyone speaks a local language, a trade language, a language of education, English, French, Portuguese, Spanish, and in addition, so many people travel from one place to another, and truck drivers that are not usually known as linguists often speak 7 or 8 languages, some completely unrelated. And mind you, at least I talked to a number and I said, how did you learn the languages? There are no dictionaries. There were no grammars. And they said, well, I had to stay overnight in that place. And I did it many times. And I began to listen. And then I began to hear. And then I started to talk. That's not a bad system for language learning, especially if you have to learn the local language in order to eat. There is a remarkable connection between the brain and the stomach when it comes to language learning. Now, some people think that all of these languages, well, they should be purified, not be contaminated by other languages. But that is sometimes very stupid. One translator was translating part of the New Testament into the Maya language. But he didn't want to use the word burro. No burros had been there till the Spanish came anyway. So he said, we want to have it pure Maya. So he made up a word, a long-eared animal. Animal with long ears. And so I asked some of the Indians, what is this animal with long ears? He said, we don't know, but it must have been a very big rabbit. Now, when there are dialects of a language, some people think that dialects have no grammar. You just throw the words together in any old way. That's not true. In the United States, black people, speak usually 2 forms of English. Standard English, if they are educated. If they are not educated, they only speak what is called Black English. But Black English also has its rules. Let's say you want to distinguish in meaning between the man has a job or the man is actually now working in the factory. Well, you have 2 ways in Black English. He be working. He be working means he has a job. He is working means he is now actually working in the factory. And this same grammatical rule goes throughout the language. But you know, there are also very important differences of communication when you use different words, especially with the second person, whether it is usted or du, whether it is du or sie in German, whether it is vous or tu in French. It makes a difference in your relationships. But I was terribly stupid in learning Spanish because when I first went to Mexico, I met a very distinguished gentleman. And of course, I used usted. And since I was supposed to be a linguist, he used usted to me. But later on, he began to work for me. And we worked together for 10 years, very closely. But I didn't know when to change the pronoun. And I kept saying usted, usted, until I felt so uncomfortable. I finally said to him, "Mais Gamano, no pudiéramos tutearnos." "Oh," he said, "I've been wanting to do that for 10 years." Well, I was just stupid. I didn't know just how and when to change. And this is a very subtle matter. In Haiti, students are supposed, of course, to study French, but outside, they always speak Haitian Creole. But if a fellow really falls in love with a girl, he immediately starts speaking French. And then the girl knows he's serious. Because French is the language of courtship and making love. But they continue then to speak French until the wedding ceremony. And it is all in French. But as they walk out of the church, from then on, it's all Haitian Creole, the language of home, of family and friends. But some languages use or are employed in different ways. Very few people anymore read or write epic poetry, a whole volume of poetry on some subject. No, but the Dinkas in the Sudan have taken the Gospels and have made them into an epic poem that lasts 3 nights as people sing these events. Or in Malayalam in India, epic poetry is still a tremendous area of pleasure for people in the use of language. We do, however, make a mistake sometimes as linguists because we get so interested in the details of what we are saying and writing. And we take what I call an anatomical approach to language. We want to analyze all the atomic elements, the individual words, and even the suffixes. But you know, in order to communicate effectively, we must move up from the anatomical level of language to the physiological level of language. How does it function? What does it do? And how does it do it? You're very fortunate to have, for example, books like Hatim and Mason on discourse and translation, work of Peignet in French, and a man by the name of Ralph Fassel, who has written 2 volumes published in Great Britain by Blackwell. One, the Sociolinguistics of Society, and the other, the Sociolinguistics of Language. Excellent introductions to an entirely new aspect of language. But most people think that if you're going to study language, what you've got to pay attention to are the words. But that's not all. verbal communication always involves a whole bundle of codes, not just words. If I should say to you, I love you, what would you think? Exactly the opposite. Because my facial features, the quality of my voice, told you immediately there was more hate than love involved. So, we always have what linguists call, or paralinguists call, paralinguistic features of language. These paralinguistic features go right along with the words themselves in the quality of the voice, the loudness. Have you ever noticed that when politicians have a very weak idea, they usually shout much louder because they're making up for something that isn't very good? Or speed of utterance. Some people speak fast because they're nervous, and others speak fast because they have so much to say and so little time. The intonation makes a tremendous difference. In English, for example, we may have a word like yeah. This is colloquial for yes. And we can describe its intonation on 4 different levels. We can say yeah, 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 yeah. Or we can say yeah, or yeah, or yeah. Or we can say yeah, yeah, yeah. Or we can say yeah. Or we can say yeah, and we mean no. So you see, intonation is part of this bundle of codes that is so important in communication. We have different pronunciations in different areas. In the United States, for example, some people from down to the south use a kind of language which isn't too easy for some of us even, who grew up in the Middle West. And we have a number of dialects, just like you have dialects here in Spain. And all languages have differences which show background, education, where a person grew up, social status, and even silence. When you expect a person to speak and it doesn't, that also carries information, because it is not zero, not nothing, it's zero, a significant absence of something. And therefore, it carries information. I don't know whether you have the expression we use in Mexico about a zero. If you say he is a zero on the left-hand side, do you have that? Yeah. Oh, and a zero on the right-hand side. That carries information too, doesn't it? Well, what about misspellings? They carry information as well. In fact, there's a tremendous job for somebody to do here in Spain. I was reading in my hotel a journal that comes out to all the hotels, to put in all the rooms of all the major hotels. I read a little document on Loudness in Barcelona. And mind you, on 5 different pages, the average number of mistakes was 19. Imagine, in just a single column. I cannot imagine publishers wishing to put out so much trash, linguistically speaking. But types of orthography make a difference. Some people prefer British spelling, and some people can't stand it. Format makes a difference. There was one man who translated the Bible, very interestingly, very popular, and he paid a great deal of attention to poetry. But he printed all the poetry like prose in the United States. And I asked him, why did you do it? Oh, he said, if I printed it like poetry, people would think it really wasn't important. It was probably not true, because they regard poetry as only somebody's dreamed up idea. In fact, a woman in South Africa wrote to the Bible Society saying how glad she was to have a Bible that had prose format and poetry, because she knew that what was in prose came from God, and what was in poetry was just somebody's idea. Exactly the opposite from what Hebrew was supposed to be saying, because in Hebrew, poetry was used in order to indicate that this was even super true. It must have come directly from divine inspiration. But they are, in addition to the paralinguistic features, there are the extra-linguistic features outside of language itself, but equally important. For example, if I should say to you in American English, how we love our boss, all I have to do is draw 2 fingers across the throat, and you will know that I hate the fella and wish he were dead. Because gestures carry a lot of meaning. Even distance carries meaning. In the Mediterranean world generally, including, of course, Spain and Italy, North Africa, the Near East, and in Egypt, people stand usually about half an arm's length away from each other. In Northern Europe and in the United States, people stand normally a whole arm's length apart when they're chatting. But if a Latin American, a businessman, comes to talk with an American businessman, he will usually come closer. And the poor American backs up. And the Latin comes closer, and the American backs up. Because the Latin thinks that someone who stands so far away is standoffish, not simpatico. But the American thinks this Latin American is aggressive, because he has penetrated what people regard as their personal space in communication. Now, all of these factors enter into really effective communication. But not only distance and things of that type are extra-linguistic, but the very publication communicates something. I read Le Monde, a weekly publication that comes to me from Paris. It's excellent, and I frankly believe most that I read. But there is another magazine in the United States called the National Enquirer, and I never believe anything I read in that kind of a publication. We had a very interesting experience one time in Argentina, and a period when there was a lot of tension, problems of people just disappearing. Revolution was the main theme of the university, and they came to us and asked us to give them permission to have the prophet Amos, who was one of the sternest prophets against corruption and abuse of the poor. And we said, fine, we'll be glad to print it for you on good paper with illustrations. And they said, no, 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 we don't want that. We want to mimeograph it on poor paper and even have it smudged so everybody will think it's a revolutionary document and they will want to read it. So, even the extra-linguistic features carry meaning. But there are other codes, complementary and sometimes competitive. Those who are interested in multimedia always say, we must have some graphics, we must have color, we must have noise, sound, music, and words. But sometimes the multimedia competes with the words. We put out such a thing for a story in the New Testament, and after the people saw it, we said, what was it about? And many of them said, we don't know. Because the multimedia drowned out the message. And sometimes this occurs with singing. The song or the melody is supposed to enhance the meaning of a song, theoretically. But I went to a concert once in Brazil. A Brazilian woman was singing, excellent soprano. She sang a series of German songs I didn't understand. Then she sang some French. I still didn't understand. Then she sang some songs in English, and I still didn't understand. And after a series of songs in Portuguese, I said to my Brazilian friend, did you understand? He said, not a word. Sometimes, you know, singers are more interested in displaying the quality of their voice rather than the content of the songs. So these other codes may actually be competing. The problem of drama, lip synchronization. Shortly after the Second World War, the Japanese decided to put on a series of bonanza in which there were cowboys and Indians fighting. But they never learned how to have lip synchronization. So after the cowboys were dead, lying there, they kept spouting Japanese. Well, this is a fascinating aspect of translation, and let me tell you, those who engage in lip synchronization for motion pictures have to be involved in tremendous changes in cultural content so as to make the words fit the meaning and the circumstances. But let's go beyond this and think of the actual functions of language. Because many people make a serious mistake in translating because they think that language is simply a matter of information. So we could call this the informative function. But I hope I can prove to you that the informative function of language is probably not more than 20%. It occurs to some extent in all communication. But even in informative communication, you cannot inform people about something unless there is something that you already share with those people. So you are adding to their information in this informative use, and much depends on the status of the person who's doing the informing. And of course, a lot depends too whether you think the information is relevant to yourself. But there's another very important aspect of function in communication, and that's the imperative function. Here, you are actually trying to change people's behavior. But you shouldn't try to do it by just a string of imperatives in the language. It's much better to tell a joke, to use an illustration, to give a parable, because people then see something concrete, something specific that would be related to their lives and be a benefit. But there's still another very important aspect, the emotive function of language. Changing people's emotional status by saying things that make them laugh or make them cry. And it is amazing how much can be communicated by words and even by non-words. The quality of voice, the tone. I had a professor once in public speech who could make us laugh, and then to the point where we also felt like crying. And he did it just by reciting the alphabet. He would say, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, and O, Q, R, S, T, U, V, W, X, Y, Z. Well, you laugh and you say, should I cry? Because you see, these extra features of language carry so much information. You know, even dogs can understand language. If you say to a dog, go away, go away, go away, here he comes. Because he's learned how to interpret the intonation and the quality of voice. I know a woman who's always shouting at her dog, come here, come here. Dog shouting. He was smarter than she was. But there's another form which is particularly important, and that's performative language. Performative means you actually change a person's status by using language. When the priest in an English-speaking world, or a government official, or somebody else with authority says, I now pronounce you man and wife. Once that is said, well, it may only cost you about $50. But to have it unsaid may cost you half of all you own. Now, it's very different in some societies. A Muslim in Malakal, out in the Sudan, one day asked me, when you get married, how do you do it? And I explained to him. Oh, then he said, but how do you get divorced? Can't you just say, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you? That's all that theoretically is necessary. I said, no, indeed. It will cost you half of all you owe. Ah, he said, I'll never become a Christian. Because he used language, performative language, in a very, very different way. And performative language normally becomes rather ritualized. And in the Bible you may read where if a boy, son, curses his parents, he's to be stoned to death, killed by stoning. And you say, how cruel, impossible. No, because according to Hebrew thought, the very act of cursing would have its effect and be the same as murder. So in all societies, matters of cursing, blessing, and all the rest represent this performative aspect of language. But in addition to the emotive and the performative, you also get language used for play. Right now in the United States, some of the popular games are language games. And I've seen language games here in your television programs. People love crossword puzzles. They love riddles. Children love what we call in English pig Latin. They take English words and add prefixes and suffixes from Latin so that you don't recognize the words in English. Children love secret codes so they can communicate without their parents recognizing what they're saying. But there's another aspect of language, and that is the aesthetic aspect. Using language in creative ways. I was on the top of a mountain not too long ago with a man who liked climbing, and he was talking about the fact that he did not wish to go to Florida, to the beaches during spring vacation, where, of course, there is a lot of sex, liquor, and volleyball. But he said to me, I just don't like this business of babes, beer, and beach ball. Say it with 4 words, all beginning with B. He could have said it many different ways. But he wanted to dress it up, make it more attractive. And later on in the conversation, he said, I love to be on the top of a peak, because then I get a 360-degree view of life. Well, he could have said it in a much more common way. But it's this desire to express oneself in this particular form. And then there is the interpersonal aspect. I can just write this, interpersonal. And this is undoubtedly the most important aspect of the sociology of language use. The way in which you talk to people on different levels. If you're having a big banquet, you might have the butler say, the guests may now enter the banquet room. But you'd never say that in your home, would you? No. You might say in English at least, meal is now being served. But if you were out at a picnic, you would say, come and get it. That's a way of saying the food is ready. Or if you're in your own home with your family, you might say, soup's on. A way of talking about a meal being ready to eat. At the same time, though, people in different parts of a country may use the words differently. For example, down in the South, and especially in South Carolina, people use words in an interesting way. Clerks in a store frequently address a woman who's shopping as dearie, honey, sweetie. And I've been there buying things and had them address me, dearie, honey, even a man. Now, I ain't never minded my wife calling me that, but when a clerk in a store calls me that, and she's never seen me before, that's too much. But I'm sure it's all right, isn't it? Okay. So much depends on context. In fact, words only have meaning in the context of the culture and the circumstances in which they are used. But if you're in doubt about that, let me give you a couple of illustrations of things that are not in proper context. One day, when a group of us were in Mexico doing some linguistic work, we had in the group a very good-looking blonde. She was the kind that everybody's with, like that. Anyway, we just had come out of a restaurant onto the street, and a very distinguished Mexican came along with a Hamburg hat, tails to his coat, stripes in his pants, lovely shoes, and he likewise looked at her. And he was so anxious to communicate somehow, but the only English he knew was evidently learned in the motion pictures. So he took off his hat, bowed very politely, and said, "Hi, babe." It just didn't fit. That's all. But I was a little shocked myself when two good friends of mine who had been in the army together met after a number of years of not seeing one another, and one of them, each of them threw their arms around each other, and one of them said, "How are you doing, you old son of a bitch?" At first I thought, this embrazo doesn't go with calling a person a son of a bitch. But actually, that was the most friendly thing he couldn't have possibly said. Because this was the language they used all the time in the army together. This reminded them both of their past experiences and their friendship. Now, words only have meanings in terms of context. That's what's important. Maybe you remember. But there are also, in addition to these sociological roles, there are also psychological factors in communication that are so important. And the first of these, of course, is the capacity to name objects or events. Children love to grab names, don't they? It's amazing that a high percentage of children 5 years of age will have a vocabulary of some 2,000 words, because words are tools to get things to happen. It's power, and children love to get new words. But in addition to that, people want to state or question. They want to use language, primarily in making a statement or making a question. Can also be, of course, an exclamation. But this drive to communicate is one of the most intense drives that people have. To be in solitary confinement for months on end will drive people to confess far more than even torture. A woman was born in the Chol area of the southern part of Mexico, where the people all spoke a Maya language called Chol, C-H-O-L. This woman was born completely deaf as a small child. But she had learned that by using her hands, her face, her body, she could signal things to other people. And this girl made up, without any knowledge of Spanish Sign Language, never having even heard about it, made up her own language, which she taught to all the women in the village, even to a linguist who was studying there. And this, she created a means of talking about any subject in the world that was within her cultural context. Incredible. But this is this dynamic drive for stating something and making some statement about it, communicating. But language also constitutes a model for our world. For instance, we talk about a dog, and he belongs to the class of canines, the wolves and others, and that person is a mammal, or that animal is a mammal, and he's finally an animal. And we do it for a cat, a feline, mammal, and animal. And we have phyla, and we have genera, we have species, families. And with our language, we create a model of the world that we know, recognize, and try to manipulate. Well, this is the use of language for psychologically modeling the world in which we live. And this is terribly important. But we also have an expressive, here I should write model, and we also use it for expression. When you start singing in the bathroom, when you're taking a shower, are you trying to communicate to anybody? You hope you don't communicate. Right? But this is a way in which we express feelings, isn't it? We use language, and we use it in special forms. I'm sure you have written letters that you never sent. In order, you wrote it to get it off your chest, we say in English. To express feelings. And you've probably written poetry you hope nobody ever reads. Just for yourself. Or you say, ouch, damn, or something else. Not to communicate to people, but to express feeling. And this, of course, is tremendously important. But the most important of all of these psychological uses of language is the cognitive. Using language to think. This is internal language. The truth is, we use language for thinking more than for anything else. It probably occupies more of our time than anything else. Now I know there are a lot of people that live without thinking, but they don't really live, really. But some people talk without thinking too, because it's so automatic. But thinking becomes the basis for a creative view of life. And we do it sometimes even in our dreams. But I think I must deal just briefly with some of what I call the anomalies of language. Things that just don't seem to make sense. In the southern part of Mexico, I have met ranchers, people of Spanish background, who speak Chol or Tzaldal, two Indian languages, perfectly well. They speak Spanish perfectly well. But ask them to interpret, to translate, they can't. Why? Because they learned those two languages and used those two languages in completely different contexts. And they've never related the contexts. And they can't relate the languages. Now this happens. Also, strangely enough, there are some people who are terrible stutterers. They can't say it. And one of the worst stutterers I've ever heard of was a first-rate simultaneous interpreter in the United Nations. Now, how can a man stutter when he is himself thinking about things and not stutter when somebody else does the thinking? That's just the point. Because whenever he is formulating a concept in his own brain about what is going to be said, he has a terrible time saying it. But if the words come in and they're picked up by the first, more or less automatic aspect of the brain, and by certain templates, he recognizes the sounds, the words, the grammar, he can immediately reproduce this in another language by this short-term memory. In fact, it's fascinating. The best simultaneous interpreters usually don't remember what they have interpreted, because it never becomes or is located in the permanent memory. They use this temporary memory short circuit. Have you noticed that the best typists who are copying documents often don't remember the content of the document because they do it completely automatic? And that's the wonderful thing about translating and communicating. Actually, we should learn languages well enough that when we take it in, we let it go in translating right to our conceptual centers in the front of the brain, and then let the brain do the job. You don't have to say, oh, shall I use a noun for that or a verb? Or shall I put the clause first or put it second? The brain can do this thing largely for us. Why not let your brain do what it does best? Sense things. And once you have a concept clear in your brain, let your voice take over. And from then on, it's largely automatic. But if you're trying to do simultaneous interpreting and think, uh-oh, should I use a verb or a noun? Should I use active, passive? You're already too late. The man has gone on to the next sentence. So, we have to develop this automaticity that exists in our brains and take advantage of what has been built in. It's also interesting that some societies don't do things the way we do. Of course, in most European societies, children learn the language of their parents. They learn, especially the local language, first, and then they learn the language of education in a bilingual society. But the Chontals, a tribe in the southern part of Mexico, reversed it. They teach their children Spanish first, so the children will have no disadvantage in school. And when the children become about 13, 14 years of age, they will not speak to them but in anything but Chontal, so they can become a part of the adult community. Now, they're not so stupid in the long run. Or other fascinating aspects. Latin Americans living in the United States who use Spanish a great deal, and also English, find themselves in a rather awkward situation because they have no difficulty, for example, in a church service, singing, of course, in Spanish, praying in Spanish, the sermon in Spanish. But what do you think they read when they read the Bible? Almost always in English. Because all of their education has been in English. The newspapers they read are mostly in English. So though they speak Spanish better than they speak English, they read English better than they can read Spanish, because they're not used to reading Spanish. Fascinating twists in language usage take place. And of course, not only do languages have their distinctive ways of talking, they have their distinctive ways of gesturing too. And some seem to gesture all the time. I have been told that some Italians would actually gesture while they were telephoning. I didn't believe it. Last time I was central part of Italy, in Milan, I saw a fella in one of these glass telephone booths. He had the speaker on his arm in order to speak. He was gesticulating at the same time. Apparently you can't speak Italian without your hands. A friend of mine speaks 3 languages, and his wife says she even knows what language he's thinking in by the facial gestures as he thinks through things in a particular language. But I don't know exactly the gestures you use here, but at least in Mexico, if it's bribery, it's this way, and if it's eating, it's this way, and if it's water, it's this way, and if it's liquor, it's this way. And all these different kinds of gestures. Gesture language goes along with these aspects. But in some cases, I have made horrible mistakes. One time I was trying to work out the alphabet of Baka. By the way, I pronounced it in such a way that these 2 sounds are made at the same time. G and B, Baka. It's not Baka or Gaka, it's Baka. Anyway, it was a 3-register tone language, 3 different registers and all the up and down glides, so you end up with about 9 different kinds of tonal patterns. But I made the mistake when I started to get words by saying to people, "What's that? What's that? What's that?" And they said, "Don't do that. That is a very bad erotic gesture." So I said, "But I've got to get these words. I have to point to things." "Of course, but you point with your lower lip." And so for the next 2 months, I went around saying, What's that? Because gesture languages are very different in various parts of the world. But as a result of some very important research in neurophysiology, not just psycholinguistics, which of course is also a very important aspect of language, but neurophysiologists, especially working with language, have shown that in the brain there are 3 sets of networks, redes. And these 3 networks have 3 quite different functions. The first network that you encounter as you hear a language, you begin to identify sounds, words, grammar. And this is done primarily not because you have an image of sounds or words, but there is a trail of synapses which can be readily activated and act like a template to identify various features of language. Now there is another very important set of networks in the frontal part of the brain dealing primarily with concepts. And the fascinating thing is that these concepts are rather close to each other if they are either in form or in usage related to one another. If they stimulate the brain, for example, for apple, and then for pear, another kind of fruit, the amount of blood which is immediately activated into the area increases, and it increases in semantic domains. And I was fascinated this morning to learn how you folks are working and developing these semantic fields or semantic domains, areas of meaning that cluster around particular words and concepts. In fact, we should always learn vocabulary in terms of these domains because they are related in our brain. Why do you think we have difficulty remembering proper names? It's because they don't come in classes. If they came in classes, in domains, we would recognize them much more readily. There is a third set of networks. To combine this network that either takes in or sends out messages. This other network combines these with the conceptual area. Of course, there are many almost incredible things about the brain. When people are injured and forget one language and not another, how can that be? How can they forget part of a language and not all of the language? Another fascinating aspect of our brains. In fact, it appears as though all the information is doubly encoded someplace. And that's where words really have their existence, in our brains, through series of synapses. And now a theory has come up with remarkable amount of documentation and proof that even the neurons in our brains are both digital and analogic. Digital in the stem of the neuron, analogical in the dendrites, these little extensions for the neuron. There are two things that we will probably never understand: the cosmos and our brains. Equally complex and terribly important. But I must speak to you about one additional thing. I have been absolutely amazed at the remarkable capacity of some translators. But one man was a Navajo Indian, an excellent interpreter and translator, especially a good interpreter. He could go from English to Navajo, Navajo to English. He was in great demand by the tribal council and the rest. But he was a horrible Bible translator when he had his fingers on his Braille text in English. And he translated almost word for word. He was too conscious of the words. So we would close the Bible, read a verse or two to him, and he would come up with an excellent interpretation. Seleskovich has said, in interpreting, grab the thought and forget the words. Grab the concept, forget the words, because let your brain do the thing it can do best. But a personal experience. I was asked to give a speech to a group of Cochiquel Indians. It was in Spanish, and my interpreter was a Cochiquel Indian who had very good Spanish. And I always ask people when I speak with an interpreter, what do you want me to do? Phrase by phrase, sentence by sentence, short paragraph by short paragraph? He said, no, give your speech. But I said, my speech is 45 minutes long. He said, that's all right. And he sat in the first row. He had no paper, no pencil. He just looked at me, and I got more and more worried. When I was near the end of my speech, I thought, this is a disaster. But he got up after my speech, reproduced my entire speech, almost sentence for sentence. Now, Cochiquel has borrowed a good many Spanish words, added Cochiquel in endings to them, and I could follow his interpretation all the way through. I knew exactly where he was. That kind of capacity, that kind of oral memory may seem incredible. But if you wanted to be a chief or an important person and have authority among the San Blas Indians, 20,000 of them, living in islands off the coast of Panama in the Caribbean, you would have to be able to recite from memory approximately 5 days of poetry and legend. Incredible. Psychologists tell us we only use approximately 10% of our brain capacity. Just think how smart we would be if we only used 50%, 5 times as much. I think you are entering into one of the most fascinating jobs you could imagine. Interlingual communication. Being exposed to some of the most fascinating ideas in the world, being related to the most complex system of human behavior, namely language, and having a chance to make an important contribution in a very rapidly shrinking world. Thank you. Spanish if you like. But maybe you don't have a question for the whole group, but I'll be around here for a while. I'll be delighted to chat with you. Thank you very much.